I was born with shackles that I could not see. They were made of habit, of acceptance, of the slow grinding certainty that this was all there was. The metal ones came later. My name was Kess, though names matter little when you are property. I learned this truth in the Manufactorum caverns beneath Hive Secundus on Mordian Prime, where the air tasted of burnt promethium and human sweat, where the ceiling pressed down like the weight of a dead god's palm. The overseers told us we were fortunate. The Imperium, in its infinite mercy, had given us purpose. We were part of something greater than ourselves. I believed this for 17 years. The caverns stretched endlessly in every direction, carved from the living rock by generations of slaves who had died with drilling bits in their hands. Overhead, the Hive City rose like a cancer toward the sky, its billions of citizens sleeping soundly while we worked through the endless night shift that had no dawn. Down here, time was measured not in hours but in quotas, not in days but in bodies dragged away when they could work no more. My station was Line 7, Section Delta. I assembled bolt shell casings with movements so practiced they had become involuntary. Pick up the metal housing, insert the charge, seal the casing, place it on the conveyor. Again, again. My hands moved without thought, scarred fingers dancing across surfaces worn smooth by a million repetitions. The rhythm was hypnotic. It was supposed to be, but I had begun to dream. The dreams came first as fragments during the 4-hour rest periods they allowed us between shifts. Brief flashes of something else. Open sky. The sensation of wind that did not carry the taste of industrial decay. Faces that showed emotion other than exhaustion or fear. These visions disturbed me more than the rats that gnawed at the corpses in the refuse pits. More than the screams that echoed from the punishment chambers when someone's quota fell short. I tried to stop dreaming. The other slaves warned me with their eyes, with the subtle shake of a head when the overseers were not looking. Dreams were dangerous. Dreams led to hope, and hope led to the kinds of thoughts that ended with a bolt shell to the back of the skull. Overseer Vex was a thin man with augmetic eyes that clicked when they focused. He moved through our section like a carrion bird, always watching for signs of weakness, of defiance, of anything that suggested we remembered we were human. I had seen him execute 17 slaves in my time on Line 7. Each time, he would announce the reason with mechanical precision. Sabotage, insubordination, failure to meet quota. The real reason was always the same. They had forgotten their place, but the dreams grew stronger. I began to see things that made no sense. Vast spaces filled with natural light, water that moved on its own, not through pipes but in great flowing channels. Plants that grew without hydroponic systems, their roots drinking from soil that had never seen industrial runoff. Most disturbing of all, I saw people who moved without the shuffling gait of the chronically malnourished, who looked up instead of down, who spoke without first calculating whether their words might be reported. These dreams came with a name that meant nothing to me. Verdania. It whispered itself through my sleeping mind like a prayer I did not understand. On the day everything changed, the dreams had become so vivid that I found myself pausing in my work, just for a moment, just long enough to close my eyes and try to hold on to the sensation of sunlight on my face. It was a mistake that would cost more than my life. Slave Kess. The voice of Overseer Vex cut through the industrial din like a blade. I opened my eyes to find his augmetics focused on me with mechanical intensity. You appear to be experiencing a malfunction. The other workers on Line 7 kept their heads down, their hands moving in perfect rhythm. They had learned the first rule of survival: never be noticed. I had forgotten it in a moment of weakness, seduced by impossible visions of a world that could not exist. No malfunction, Overseer, I replied, my voice steady despite the ice forming in my stomach, a momentary adjustment to improve efficiency. He studied me for a long moment that stretched like a blade across my throat. Then he nodded, a gesture that somehow conveyed more threat than any words could have managed. Continue your duties, he said. I will be monitoring your output personally." As he moved away, I felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. But more than that, I felt something else stirring in the depths of my mind. For the first time in 17 years, I found myself wondering not just what lay beyond the manufactorum, but whether I might somehow see it. The thought was so heretical it made my hands shake, but once born it proved impossible to kill. The shift continued for another 8 hours, but I barely noticed the passage of time. My hands continued their practiced movements, while my mind wandered through territories that had been forbidden since birth. I thought about the guards who patrolled the perimeter, their routines and habits. I thought about the supply tunnels that connected our section to the processing centers. Most dangerously of all, I thought about the stories the older slaves sometimes whispered during rest periods. Stories of places beyond the hive cities, places where the sky was not hidden behind layers of industrial smog, places like Verdania. When the klaxon finally sounded to signal the end of shift, I filed out with the others toward the communal sleeping chambers. But instead of collapsing onto my assigned mat, I found myself lingering in the corridors, studying the patterns of movement, the placement of surveillance servitors, the gaps in the seemingly perfect system of control. It was then that I encountered Jorik. He was older than most slaves survived to become, his face a map of scars and premature lines. Unlike the others, he did not avoid my gaze when I looked at him. Instead, he studied me with eyes that seemed to hold secrets. "You have the look," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the distant hum of machinery. "What look?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "The look of someone who has begun to see beyond the walls." He glanced around to ensure we were not observed, then stepped closer. "It is a dangerous thing, young Kess, but perhaps it is also necessary." He knew my name, though I had never spoken to him before. This should have alarmed me, but instead I felt a strange sense of recognition, as if I had been waiting my entire life for this conversation. "Tell me about Verdania," I said. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment I thought he might flee. But then his expression hardened into something like determination. "Not here," he whispered. "Too many ears, too many eyes. But if you truly wish to know, meet me at the water recycling station during the next rest period. Come alone, and tell no one." Then he was gone, vanishing into the crowd of exhausted workers like smoke dissipating in industrial wind. I spent the remaining hours of my rest period staring at the ceiling of the sleeping chamber, listening to the sounds of my fellow slaves. Some snored, their bodies claiming what little respite they could find. Others wept quietly, though they had learned to muffle even their grief. A few muttered prayers to the Emperor, begging for strength to endure another day of servitude. But I found myself thinking about choice. It was a concept so foreign to my existence that I had no framework for understanding it. We did what we were told. We worked when commanded. We slept when permitted. We lived according to schedules and quotas and the endless rhythm of industrial necessity. Yet somehow, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, I had discovered that there might be alternatives. When the time came, I made my way through the darkened corridors toward the water recycling station. The path took me through sections of the manufactorum I had rarely seen, past machinery so ancient that its original purpose had been forgotten, through chambers where the walls wept condensation that might once have been human tears. Jorik was waiting for me beside a massive filtration tank, his figure barely visible in the dim emergency lighting. He looked older in the shadows, more fragile, but also somehow more real than any person I had ever encountered. "You came," he said, and I heard surprise in his voice. "You knew I would. I hoped. Hope is all we have left down here, though they try to take even that from us." He gestured for me to sit beside him on a section of pipe that jutted from the wall. "What I am about to tell you may destroy you, Kess, or it may save you. I no longer know the difference. Tell me." He was quiet for a long time, his eyes focused on something beyond the walls of our prison, When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of accumulated grief. "I was not always a slave," he began. "Once, long ago, I walked beneath open sky. I felt rain on my face that had fallen from clouds, not from the recycling systems of an industrial hive. I knew the sensation of grass beneath my feet, of wind that carried the scent of growing things rather than the stench of decay." "That is impossible," I said, though my heart was racing. "There are only the hive cities, only the manufactorums and processing centers and endless corridors of service and production." "Is it?" He turned to look at me directly. "Think, Kess. What do you know of the world beyond these walls? What have you seen with your own eyes, rather than simply accepted because it is what you have been told?" The question struck me like a physical blow. I realized that everything I believed about existence beyond the manufactorum was built on assumptions, on the casual statements of overseers, on the unexamined acceptance that this was all there was. "I know nothing," I admitted. "Exactly, and in that ignorance, they have imprisoned us more effectively than any chain ever could." His voice grew softer, more dangerous. "But some of us remember, some of us carry the knowledge of what was taken from us." "What was taken?" "Everything." The word fell between us like a stone into still water. Our homes, our families, our freedom, our very identities as human beings rather than units of production. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Verdania exists, Kess. It is a world of forests and rivers, of cities built for beauty rather than efficiency, a place where human beings live as something more than slaves or masters. I was born there, before the imperial tithe collectors came, before they decided that our world's greatest resource was not its minerals or its strategic position, but its people." The words hit me like hammer blows. Everything I had been taught about the glory of service, about the honor of contributing to the Imperium's great work, began to crumble like poorly mixed concrete. "How many of us are there?" I asked. "How many remember?" "Fewer each year. The older slaves die, and the younger ones are born into this system without ever knowing anything else existed. Soon, all memory of the outer worlds will be lost, and we will become exactly what they want us to be, willing participants in our own enslavement." "But you remembered. You kept the knowledge alive." "I did. But what good has it done? I have spent 30 years in these caverns, watching friends die, watching hope slowly drain away like water through cracked stone. Memory without action is just another form of torture." There was something in his voice that made me look at him more carefully. Beneath the resignation, I heard something else, something that might have been preparation. "You are planning something," I said. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the tattered remains of his work coveralls and withdrew something that made my breath catch. It was a small piece of metal, worked into the shape of a leaf. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each vein and curve rendered with loving detail. But more than its beauty, it was what the object represented that made my hands tremble. It was proof. Proof that somewhere in the galaxy, people still created things for reasons other than efficiency or function. They made beauty. They made art. They made objects that serve no purpose except to remind the observer that there was more to existence than mere survival. "Where did you get this?" I whispered. "I made it. From scraps of metal stolen over the course of years. It is my memory of Verdania given form, my reminder that I was once more than this." He placed the leaf in my palm, and it felt warm despite the cold air of the recycling station. "But memory alone is not enough. Not anymore." "What do you mean?" "I mean that tomorrow, during the shift change, there will be an opportunity. The transport that brings raw materials from the upper levels will be lightly guarded. Its route takes it through sections of the complex where surveillance is minimal. For perhaps 10 minutes, there will be a chance." "A chance for what?" "Escape." The word hung between us like an explosive device waiting to detonate. Escape. It was not a concept that belonged in our vocabulary. It was not something we were permitted to consider. Yet here it was, offered to me like a gift that might destroy us both. "It is impossible," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were lies. Not impossible, just incredibly dangerous. Perhaps, but I would rather die attempting to reclaim my humanity than continue existing as a component in someone else's machine. He stood, his movements stiff with age and accumulated damage. "I will not ask you to come with me, Kess. The choice must be yours alone. But if you decide to try, meet me at loading bay 7 tomorrow when the shift klaxon sounds." He turned to leave, then paused. "And if you choose not to come, forget this conversation ever happened. Forget the leaf, forget Verdania. Return to your station and live whatever life they allow you. It may not be freedom, but it is survival, and survival is not without its own value." Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the impossible gift in my palm and a decision that would define everything that came after. I returned to my sleeping mat, but rest was impossible. The metal leaf seemed to burn against my skin where I had hidden it beneath my coveralls. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw visions of open sky and growing things. But I also saw the faces of executed slaves, their eyes empty and accusing. Around me, my fellow workers slept the sleep of the exhausted, their bodies claiming what little respite they could find before the next shift began. They looked so peaceful in the darkness, freed temporarily from the weight of their chains. Part of me envied them. They had never been burdened with choice. They had never been forced to confront the possibility that their lives might be something other than they were. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since the dreams began, looked at them with something approaching pity. They were asleep in more ways than one, and I was no longer certain that ignorance was truly a blessing. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. When the klaxon finally sounded to signal the beginning of the next work period, I rose with the others and made my way toward line 7. But instead of the mindless efficiency that usually characterized our movements, I found myself studying everything with new eyes. The guards who shepherded us through the corridors were not the invincible enforcers I had always believed them to be. They were tired men with aging equipment, going through motions they had repeated countless times. The surveillance servitors that tracked our movements had blind spots, gaps in their coverage that a careful observer might exploit. The very size and complexity of the manufactorum that had once seemed like proof of our imprisonment now revealed itself as a maze with hidden passages and forgotten chambers. For the first time in my life, I began to see the system not as an immutable law of nature, but as something created by human beings. And what humans had built, other humans might find ways to circumvent. At my station, I went through the familiar motions of assembling bolt shell casings, but my mind was elsewhere. I thought about Jorik's words, about the world he described, about the choice that lay before me like an abyss. Every few minutes, I would touch the hidden leaf through the fabric of my coveralls, feeling its warmth and remembering that beauty was possible. Overseer Vex made his rounds as always, his augmetic eyes clicking as they focused on each worker in turn. When he reached my station, he paused longer than usual, his mechanical gaze studying my movements with analytical precision. "Your efficiency has improved, Slave Kess," he observed. "Yesterday's correction appears to have been effective." "Yes, Overseer, I am grateful for your guidance." "Good. The Imperium rewards those who learn from their mistakes." He moved to continue his rounds, then stopped. "However, I sense something different about you today. A quality I cannot quite define." My blood turned to ice, but I kept my hands moving in their practiced rhythm. "I do not understand, Overseer. Perhaps it is nothing, but I have learned to trust my instincts when it comes to identifying potential problems." His augmetic eyes whirred softly as they adjusted focus. "I will be watching you closely, Slave Kess. Very closely indeed." As he moved away, I felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing pressing down on my shoulders. But rather than crushing me, it seemed to strengthen my resolve. If I was already under suspicion, then I had little left to lose. The choice was no longer between safety and risk, but between certain slow death and the possibility of something more. The shift dragged on with unbearable slowness. Each hour felt like a day, each minute an eternity of waiting. Around me, my fellow slaves continued their work with mechanical precision, unaware that one among them was preparing to shatter the only world they had ever known. As the end of shift approached, I found myself studying their faces more carefully than ever before. Mira, who worked the station next to mine, humming quietly to herself as she assembled detonator circuits with practiced ease. Old Henrik, whose cough had been getting worse for months, but who continued working because the alternative was the corpse pit. Young Tam, barely 16, who still sometimes cried in his sleep for parents he could barely remember. What would happen to them if I succeeded? What would happen if I failed? For the first time, I began to understand the true weight of choice. It was not just my own life I was risking, but the delicate balance of resignation that kept all of us alive. But then I thought of the leaf hidden against my skin, of Jorik's description of Verdania, of the dreams that had shown me glimpses of what human existence might become, and I realized that some risks were worth taking, not despite the cost, but because of it. When the shift klaxon finally sounded, I joined the stream of workers moving toward the dormitories. But as we passed the junction that led to Loading Bay 7, I quietly separated myself from the group and slipped into the shadows of a maintenance alcove. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain the surveillance servitors would detect it. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow potentially concealing a guard or an informant. But slowly, carefully, I made my way through passages I had never traveled before, following half-remembered directions toward a rendezvous that might be the last decision I would ever make. Loading Bay 7 was a cavernous space filled with industrial equipment and the constant rumble of heavy machinery. Massive conveyor systems moved raw materials from the transport vehicles to processing centers deeper in the complex. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of chemical solvents. I found Jorik waiting beside a towering stack of metal ingots, his figure almost invisible in the industrial gloom. When he saw me, something in his expression shifted from resignation to something that might have been hope. "You came," he said. "I came. Do you understand what this means? What we are about to attempt? I understand that I cannot continue living as I have. Beyond that, I understand very little." He nodded slowly. "Perhaps that is enough. Understanding can be a burden, and we will have enough of those to carry." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching machinery echoed through the loading bay. A massive transport vehicle rounded the corner, its treads grinding against the rockcrete floor as it maneuvered toward the unloading station. Behind it came two more vehicles, equally massive, carrying materials from the upper levels of the hive. "There," Jorik whispered, pointing toward the third transport. "Its cargo bay is only half full, and the guards are tired from a double shift. When it begins to move toward the exit tunnel, we will have perhaps 60 seconds to reach it and find concealment among the cargo containers. And then we pray to whatever gods might still listen to slaves, and we hope that freedom is worth the price we will pay for it." The transport completed its unloading cycle and began to turn toward the exit tunnel. For a moment, I hesitated. This was the point of no return, the moment when I would transform from a productive unit of the Imperium into something else entirely, a fugitive, a rebel, a human being making a choice. Then Jorik began to run, his aged legs carrying him across the loading bay with surprising speed. And without thinking, without allowing myself time to reconsider, I followed. The next few moments passed in a blur of desperate motion and hammering heartbeats. We reached the transport as it began to accelerate, threw ourselves onto its rear platform, and crawled between massive cargo containers just as the vehicle entered the exit tunnel. Behind us, the loading bay disappeared into darkness. Ahead lay something I had never imagined I would see: the outside world, the unknown, the possibility of whatever lay beyond the walls of our prison. As the transport climbed through the tunnel system toward the surface levels of the hive, I pressed my face against a gap between containers and caught my first glimpse of something that made my breath catch. Light. Not the artificial illumination of the manufactorums, but something else entirely. Something that suggested the existence of spaces larger than any chamber I had ever imagined. "Jorik," I whispered. "Is that what I think it is?" He moved to look through the gap beside me, and I saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Sunlight," he said. "After 30 years of imprisonment, I am seeing sunlight." The transport continued its climb through levels of the hive I had never known existed. Past residential districts where ordinary citizens lived in conditions that seemed luxurious compared to our underground chambers. Past commercial sectors where people moved freely, choosing their own paths rather than following predetermined routes. Past administrative centers where officials made decisions that affected millions of lives without ever considering the cost in human suffering. And finally, impossibly, we emerged onto the surface of the world itself. I had dreamed of open sky, but the reality was so overwhelming that I nearly lost consciousness. The sheer vastness of it, the sense of space extending in every direction without walls or ceiling or boundaries of any kind. Above us, the sky was a pale gray color I had no name for, and in the distance, something burned with impossible brightness. "The sun," Jorik explained, seeing my confusion. "The star that gives light and warmth to this world. You have never seen it before because they kept us buried beneath tons of rockcrete and steel." The transport was moving through what appeared to be a vast industrial district, but even here I could see things that challenged everything I had believed about existence. Buildings that served purposes other than production, vehicles that carried people rather than cargo. Most incredibly of all, people who moved without the shuffling gait of chronic exhaustion, who looked up at the sky rather than down at the ground. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Away from here. As far as these transports travel before returning to the loading bays." He paused, studying the landscape rolling past us. "There is a spaceport on the outskirts of the hive. Ships come and go carrying cargo and passengers to other worlds. If we can reach it, if we can find passage somehow, then perhaps we might eventually reach Verdania. And if we cannot, then we will have had this much, at least. We will have seen the sky. We will have remembered what it feels like to be human." The journey to the spaceport took several hours, during which I experienced more wonder and terror than in all the previous years of my life combined. Wonder at the sheer scale and complexity of the world beyond the manufactorums. Terror at the knowledge that we were now completely cut off from everything familiar, fugitives in a landscape we did not understand. When the transport finally began to slow, approaching what appeared to be a massive complex of landing platforms and warehouse facilities, Jorik and I prepared to disembark. We had no plan beyond reaching the spaceport, no resources except our determination, no skills beyond those required for industrial assembly. But we had something else. Something that the overseers had tried to take from us but had never quite succeeded in destroying completely. We had hope. The transport came to a stop at a cargo transfer station on the edge of the spaceport complex. As workers began to unload the containers that had concealed us, we slipped away into the maze of buildings and landing platforms that stretched as far as the eye could see. And for the first time in either of our lives, we were free. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Free. The word had no meaning in the context of my previous existence, no framework for understanding. But here, walking through corridors where no overseer watched our every movement, where no quotas measured our worth, where no klaxons marked the boundaries of our existence, I began to understand what Jorik had been trying to tell me. We were no longer property. We were human beings with the power to make choices, even if those choices led to our destruction. The spaceport was a city unto itself, filled with people from across the Imperium. Merchants and pilgrims, soldiers and administrators, all moving with the casual freedom of those who had never known true bondage. Among them, Jorik and I were invisible, just two more figures in work coveralls, unremarkable enough to avoid attention. But our freedom came with a price I had not anticipated. Without the structure of the manufactorum, without the familiar rhythm of shifts and quotas and assigned duties, I found myself overwhelmed by the sheer number of choices available to us. Where should we go? What should we do? How did free people decide such things? Jorik, drawing on memories of a life before enslavement, led us through the complex toward the passenger terminals. His plan, such as it was, focused on finding transport to Verdania, but as we moved deeper into the spaceport, it became clear that this would be more difficult than either of us had imagined. The ships that traveled between worlds required payment, documentation, official approval for passenger manifests. We had none of these things. We were escaped slaves with no identity beyond our service numbers, no currency except the hope that had carried us this far. "We need to find work," Jorik said as we sheltered in a maintenance area between terminals. "Honest work, paid work, something that will give us the resources to book passage legitimately." "What kind of work can escaped slaves find at a spaceport?" "The kind of work that free people do," he replied. "We are no longer slaves, Kess. We must stop thinking of ourselves as such." It sounded simple when he said it, but the reality proved far more complex. Freedom, I was learning, was not simply the absence of chains. It was a skill that had to be developed, a way of thinking that had to be cultivated. After 17 years of having every decision made for us, the prospect of choosing our own path was both exhilarating and terrifying. We spent the next several days learning to navigate this new world. We found temporary work loading and unloading cargo, jobs that required no documentation and paid in small denominations of imperial currency. We slept in maintenance areas and abandoned storage compartments, ate scraps from the food vendors that served the spaceport's legitimate passengers. It was a hard existence, but it was ours. For the first time in our lives, the work we did served our own purposes rather than those of distant masters. The exhaustion we felt at the end of each day was earned rather than imposed. Even our hunger was a form of freedom, a consequence of our own choices rather than the calculated rationing of our captors. But always, beneath the small joys of liberation, was the knowledge that we were living on borrowed time. Escaped slaves were valuable property, and the Imperium did not easily forgive theft of its resources. Eventually, someone would notice our absence. Eventually, the hunt would begin. On our 7th day at the spaceport, that eventuality became reality. I was working a loading shift on Platform 12 when I saw them. 3 figures in the grey uniforms of Manufactorum security, moving through the crowd with the methodical patience of professional hunters. They carried data slates displaying images I could not see clearly, but their purpose was obvious. They were looking for us. I found Jorik at his assigned station and warned him with a subtle gesture we had developed during our brief time as free men. Without speaking, we abandoned our work and made our way toward the emergency exits that had become our escape routes and hiding places. But as we moved through the service corridors beneath the passenger terminals, it became clear that our pursuers had anticipated this response. More security personnel were stationed at the exits, their positions chosen to cut off any attempt at flight. "They knew we would come here," Jorik said as we crouched in the shadows of a maintenance alcove. "They understand escaped slaves better than we understand freedom." "Then what do we do?" "We make a choice that they will not expect." His voice carried a calm that seemed impossible under the circumstances. "We stop running and start fighting." "Fighting? We have no weapons, no training, no resources. What can 2 escaped slaves do against the security apparatus of the Imperium? We can remember what we learned in the manufactorums." He reached into his coveralls and withdrew the metal leaf he had shown me days earlier. "We can create something they cannot control." I did not understand what he meant until he began to move through the maintenance area with purpose I had never seen in him before. He was not running now, not hiding. He was working, his hands moving with the same practiced efficiency he had once applied to industrial assembly. But instead of creating components for weapons of war, he was fashioning something else entirely. Using scraps of metal and wire salvaged from the maintenance equipment around us, He began to construct a device whose purpose became clear only when it was nearly complete. A transmitter. Crude but functional, capable of broadcasting across the spaceport's communication networks. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I am giving them a choice," he replied. "The same choice they gave us all those years ago, though they never realized it." He activated the device, and his voice began to echo through the public address systems of the spaceport. "Citizens of the Imperium," he began, his words carrying across platforms and terminals, reaching the ears of thousands of travelers and workers and officials. "You are listening to the voice of a slave. Not a former slave, not an escaped slave, but a human being who was stolen from his home and forced to work in the darkness beneath your cities." Around us, I could hear the sounds of security forces moving closer, but Jorik continued speaking with calm determination. "For 30 years, I assembled components for weapons that would be used to conquer other worlds, to take other people from their homes and reduce them to the same slavery I endured. I did this work because I was told it served the greater good, because I was told that my suffering had meaning in the context of the Imperium's glory." His voice was growing stronger now, more certain, carrying across the spaceport like a song of defiance. "But I have remembered something that they tried to take from us. I have remembered that human beings are not components in a machine. We are not resources to be consumed in service of distant masters. We are people with the right to choose our own destiny, even if that choice leads to our destruction." The security forces were close now. I could see their lights moving through the corridors, hear their boots on the metal flooring, but somehow their approach no longer seemed threatening. They were just people doing a job, following orders, serving a system that had reduced us all to functions rather than recognizing us as human beings. "There are thousands of slaves working beneath this hive," Jorik continued, "millions throughout the Imperium, people who have forgotten that they were once free, who have accepted that their lives belong to others. But freedom is not something that can be taken permanently. It can only be forgotten, and memory can be recovered." He looked at me then, his eyes bright with something I had never seen before. "Tell them about Verdania," he said. And suddenly I understood what he was asking me to do, not just to speak, but to bear witness, to carry forward the memory of what we had discovered, even if neither of us survived to see it fulfilled. I took the transmitter from his hands and felt the weight of choice settle on my shoulders like armor. "Verdania is a world where people grow their own food in soil that has never been poisoned by industrial runoff," I began, my voice steady despite the approaching footsteps. "It is a place where children play in sunlight instead of working in darkness, where art is created for beauty rather than efficiency, where human beings are valued for their humanity rather than their productivity." The security forces had found us now. I could see their weapons raised, their faces hidden behind tactical visors. But I could also see something else. Behind the visors, I glimpsed eyes that showed something other than mechanical obedience. They were listening. "Some of you have seen such places," I continued, speaking not just to the security forces but to everyone within range of the transmission. "Some of you remember what it feels like to be free. That memory is not lost, not forgotten, not destroyed by chains or quotas or the grinding weight of servitude. It lives in all of us, waiting to be reclaimed." The lead security officer stepped forward, his weapon trained on my chest. "Surrender now, and your termination will be swift," he said. But his voice carried something I had not expected to hear: uncertainty. Behind the words of command, I heard the question that was being asked not just of us, but of himself. "I will not surrender," I replied, "not because I am brave, but because surrender means returning to the darkness, and I have seen too much light to accept that willingly." Jorik moved to stand beside me, his weathered face calm with acceptance. "We choose to die as human beings rather than live as property," he said. For a long moment, the corridor was silent except for the hum of machinery and the distant sounds of the spaceport. The security officer's weapon remained trained on us, but he did not fire. Around him, his fellow officers waited for orders that did not come. Then, impossibly, the man lowered his weapon. "I remember Verdania," he said quietly. The words fell between us like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through the assembled security forces. I saw recognition flicker behind other visors, saw weapons waver as hands that had been trained to kill without question suddenly remembered what it felt like to choose. "Sergeant Kane," one of the officers said, his voice tight with confusion. "Your orders?" The man who had spoken of Verdania, Sergeant Kane, stood frozen between duty and memory. His weapon hung at his side now, forgotten, while his augmetic eye whirred softly as it processed information his human mind was struggling to accept. "I was born there," he said, his words barely audible above the mechanical hum of the spaceport. "Before the tithe collectors came, before they decided our world was more valuable for its people than its resources." Another officer stepped forward, younger, his face still hidden behind his visor. "Sergeant, we have our orders. These are escaped, Imperial property. They must be returned to their designated function or terminated." But Kane was no longer listening to Imperial doctrine. He was listening to something deeper, something that had been buried beneath years of conditioning and obedience. "Do you know what we grew on Verdania?" he asked, his voice growing stronger. "Not corpse starch or synthetic nutrients, real food. Fruits and vegetables that tasted like sunshine and rain. My family had an orchard. Apple trees that my great-grandfather had planted that would have fed my children if I had been allowed to have any." The young officer's weapon remained steady, but I could see uncertainty in his posture. "The past is irrelevant, Sergeant. We serve the Emperor's will now." "Whose will?" Kane turned to face his subordinate, and I saw tears streaming down his scarred cheeks. "The Emperor who demands that human beings be reduced to numbers in a production quota. The Emperor who separates children from their families to feed the endless hunger of his war machine. Or the Emperor we were told to worship, who supposedly values human dignity and the sacred nature of imperial citizenship." The questions hung in the air like accusations. Around us, more security personnel were arriving, but instead of creating an atmosphere of increasing threat, their presence seemed to amplify the weight of Kaine's words. These were not faceless enforcers of imperial will. They were people, many of whom carried their own memories of loss, their own buried understanding of what had been taken from them. Yorick stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid triggering a violent response. "How many of you remember worlds that no longer exist as they were?" he asked. "How many of you have families you will never see again because duty requires you to be here, enforcing a system that treats human beings as resources to be consumed?" "Silence," the young officer commanded, but his voice lacked conviction. "You are criminals, escaped slaves attempting to corrupt loyal imperial servants with seditious propaganda." "Are we?" I found myself speaking, the words flowing from some source deeper than conscious thought. "Or are we simply people who refuse to accept that this is all we are allowed to be?" I reached into my coveralls and withdrew the metal leaf Jorik had given me, holding it up so that everyone could see its delicate craftsmanship. This was made by a slave in the few minutes he could steal between shifts, using scraps of metal that would have been recycled into instruments of war. It serves no function except to remind us that beauty is possible, that human beings are capable of creating something more than the machinery of their own oppression. Several of the security officers stepped closer, drawn by curiosity despite their training. In the harsh lighting of the corridor, the leaf seemed to glow with its own inner warmth. "It is just a piece of scrap metal," the young officer said. But there was something in his voice that suggested he understood its true significance. "No," Kaine said softly. "It is proof that we are more than what they tell us we are." The standoff continued for several more minutes, but something fundamental had shifted. The clear lines between captor and captive, between law and rebellion, had become blurred by the introduction of a third element: memory. The collective recollection of what had been lost, what had been taken, what might still be possible if enough people chose to remember. It was Kaine who broke the impasse. "Lower your weapons," he commanded. "Sergeant, I cannot comply with that order," the young officer replied. "Protocol requires." "Protocol can burn in the warp," Kane snapped. "I am giving you a direct command. Lower your weapons and stand down." One by one, the security forces complied. Not because they had been ordered to, but because they had been reminded of something they had forgotten. They were not machines programmed to enforce compliance. They were human beings capable of making choices, even choices that contradicted their training. "What happens now?" I asked. Kane looked at me for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been hope. "Now we find out whether the Imperium can survive the knowledge that its people are capable of choosing their own destiny," he said. He activated his comm unit and spoke into it with calm authority. "Control, this is Security Team 7. The escaped slaves have been located, but the situation requires special handling. I am requesting an immediate conference with the spaceport administrator." "Acknowledged, Sergeant Kane. Is the threat contained?" Kane looked at Jorik and me, then at his fellow officers, then at the metal leaf still glowing in my palm. "The threat is contained," he replied, "but the situation is more complex than initially reported." What followed was unlike anything I had imagined possible within the rigid hierarchy of Imperial administration. Instead of summary execution or immediate return to bondage, Jorik and I found ourselves escorted to a conference room in the spaceport's administrative complex. Not as prisoners, but as something the system had no protocol for handling, human beings asserting their right to be treated as such. The spaceport administrator was a thin woman with tired eyes and the worn expression of someone who had spent decades navigating Imperial bureaucracy. When we were brought before her, she studied us with the clinical detachment of someone accustomed to processing problems rather than people. "You are escaped slaves from Manufactorum Complex 7, she said, consulting her data slate. "Imperial property valued at approximately 3,000 thrones each, specialized in munitions assembly with 17 and 30 years of training respectively." "We are human beings," Jorik replied simply. "Human beings who are also Imperial property under Codex Administratum Classification 77 Alpha. Your unauthorized departure from your assigned function constitutes theft of Imperial resources punishable by immediate termination." She spoke the words with mechanical precision, but I noticed that she did not meet our eyes as she said them. Behind the official language, I sensed the presence of someone who understood the weight of what she was being asked to enforce. Kane stepped forward. "Administrator Chen, I request permission to submit an alternative assessment of the situation." She looked at him with surprise. "Sergeant, the protocol for handling escaped slaves is clearly defined. There is no alternative assessment required." "With respect, Administrator, I believe there are factors present that fall outside normal protocol parameters." "Explain." What followed was one of the most remarkable conversations I had ever witnessed. Kane, drawing on his authority as a security officer and his memories as a free human being, began to describe what we had shared during our confrontation in the maintenance corridors. Not as seditious propaganda, but as information relevant to Imperial security and efficiency. He spoke about the productivity losses inherent in slave-based manufacturing systems, where workers had no incentive to innovate or improve processes. He described the security risks created by maintaining large populations of resentful forced laborers in close proximity to strategic facilities. Most importantly, he presented evidence that many of the Imperium's most valuable citizens carried memories of pre-imperial freedom that could be valuable resources if properly utilized rather than suppressed. Administrator Chen listened with growing interest, her tired eyes beginning to show signs of engagement I doubted she had felt in years. "Are you suggesting that escaped slaves should be treated as defectors rather than stolen property?" she asked. "I am suggesting that people who demonstrate initiative, resourcefulness, and specialized knowledge might be more valuable as voluntary citizens than as forced laborers," Kane replied. It was a radical concept, one that challenged fundamental assumptions about Imperial resource management, But it was also pragmatic enough to appeal to an administrator whose career depended on finding efficient solutions to complex problems. "What exactly are you proposing?" Chen asked. Kane looked at us, then back at the administrator. "I propose that these individuals be granted provisional citizenship status, with assignment to duties that utilize their skills, while allowing them the freedom to contribute voluntarily to imperial objectives. That is not possible under current regulations. Then perhaps the regulations require modification." The words hung in the air like a challenge to the entire system of imperial governance. But instead of rejecting them immediately, Chen leaned back in her chair and considered them with the careful attention of someone accustomed to finding creative solutions within bureaucratic constraints. "The legal complexities would be substantial," she said finally. "Questions of ownership, compensation for lost property, precedent-setting implications for slave populations throughout the sector." "Yes," Kaine agreed. "But the potential benefits might justify those complexities. Consider the propaganda value of demonstrating imperial mercy and justice. Consider the intelligence opportunities presented by voluntary cooperation from individuals with detailed knowledge of underground manufacturing operations. Consider the productivity gains achievable when workers have genuine motivation to excel." Chen turned her attention back to Jorik and me. "And what do you propose to offer the Imperium in exchange for this unprecedented consideration?" Jorik answered without hesitation. "Everything we know about the slave operations beneath this hive. Names, locations, security procedures, production capabilities. Information that could help the Imperium transition to more efficient systems while maintaining security and productivity. And after that, we ask only for the opportunity to prove that free people serve the Emperor more effectively than slaves ever could." It was a bold offer, one that transformed us from escaped property into potential assets. But more than that, it was a demonstration of something the imperial system rarely encountered. People choosing to serve not because they were forced to, but because they believed in the possibility of something better. Chen studied us for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she activated her comm unit and began to speak with quiet authority. "I am declaring this a special administrative situation under Emergency Protocol 12. I want full documentation of everything these individuals can provide about underground operations, and I want a complete analysis of the feasibility of implementing voluntary labor programs in high-security manufacturing facilities." She looked at us directly for the first time since we had entered her office. "You will remain in protective custody while this analysis is conducted, not as prisoners, but as imperial citizens under administrative review. If your information proves valuable and your proposals feasible, you may find that the Imperium is more adaptable than you believed. And if not," I asked, "then you will have lived as free people for a few more days than you otherwise would have," she replied. "Sometimes that is all anyone can ask for." We were escorted to quarters in the administrative complex that were unlike anything I had ever experienced. A small room with an actual window that looked out onto the landing platforms where ships came and went carrying people to destinations across the galaxy, a bed with clean sheets, access to a shower with water that ran hot, food that had been prepared for taste rather than mere nutritional necessity. But more than the physical comforts, what overwhelmed me was the silence. For the first time in my life, I experienced the absence of industrial noise. No grinding machinery, no klaxons marking shift changes, no constant reminder that every moment belonged to someone else. I could think my own thoughts without interruption. I could choose when to sleep, when to wake, when to eat. The freedom was so complete it was almost frightening. Jorik adapted more quickly than I did, perhaps because his memories reached back to a time before enslavement. He spent his days working with imperial analysts, sharing everything he knew about the manufactorum systems while developing proposals for transitional programs that could gradually replace slave labor with voluntary service. I found myself assigned to a different task. Administrator Chen had requested that I document my personal experience of slavery and escape, not for administrative purposes but for what she called psychological analysis of imperial resource management efficiency. Quote, "Writing was a skill I had never been taught, but speaking was something I could do. Hour after hour, I sat in a small office and shared my memories with recording devices that would preserve them for analysis and distribution. I spoke about the dreams that had awakened me to possibility. I described the moment when I first saw sunlight, the overwhelming vastness of open sky, the simple miracle of choosing my own path. But I also spoke about the cost. The other slaves who remained in the darkness, who had never been given the chance to remember their humanity. The system that reduced human beings to components in a vast machine of production and consumption. The weight of knowing that my freedom had come at the price of abandoning people who deserved the same opportunity. The recordings would eventually become part of something larger than either Jorik or I had imagined. Administrator Chen, working with contacts throughout the imperial bureaucracy, had begun to build a case for systematic reform of slave-based manufacturing. Not from humanitarian concerns, which carried little weight in imperial decision-making, but from purely practical considerations of efficiency, security, and resource optimization. Our escape had become the catalyst for a conversation about whether the Imperium could afford to continue treating its people as disposable resources. It was a conversation that would take years to resolve, that would face resistance from entrenched interests and established procedures. But it was happening, and that was more than I had ever dared to hope. 3 months after our escape, we received our answer. Jorik and I were summoned back to Administrator Chen's office, where we found her reviewing a thick folder of documents bearing official imperial seals. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I thought I detected something that might have been satisfaction in her tired eyes. "Your provisional status has been reviewed and approved by the sector administration," she announced. "You are hereby granted full imperial citizenship with all associated rights and responsibilities." The words should have filled me with joy, but instead I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and grief. We had won our freedom, but the victory felt incomplete while so many others remained in bondage. "What about the others?" I asked. "The slaves still working in the manufactorums?" "Change is slow within the Imperium," Chen replied, "but change is possible. Your information has led to the establishment of 3 pilot programs for transitional labor systems in manufacturing facilities across the sector. If successful, they may be expanded. It was not everything I had hoped for, but it was a beginning, and sometimes beginnings were all that anyone could ask for." Jorik was assigned to a position within the Imperial Manufacturing Authority, where his knowledge of both slave and free production systems would help design new approaches to industrial organization. I was offered a choice of several positions, but the one that called to me was unexpected. I requested assignment as a counselor for refugees and displaced persons arriving at Imperial spaceports. People who, like us, had been torn from their original lives and forced to navigate systems they did not understand. People who needed someone who could remind them that they were more than the circumstances that had brought them to Imperial attention. My first assignment was to help process a group of survivors from a hive world that had been devastated by Orcish invasion. They arrived broken and traumatized, carrying nothing but the clothes they wore and the memories of everything they had lost. As I worked with them, helping them understand their options and opportunities within Imperial society, I found myself thinking about the metal leaf that still rested in my personal effects. It had become a symbol not just of beauty in the midst of ugliness, but of the human capacity to create meaning from the raw materials of existence. Each person I worked with carried their own version of that leaf, some memory, some skill, some dream that had survived the destruction of everything familiar. My job was to help them recognize those inner resources and find ways to transform them into new possibilities. It was work that had meaning beyond mere survival, purpose beyond simple obedience. It was the kind of work that could only be done by someone who chose to do it, who found value in the act of service itself rather than in the rewards or punishments that might follow. Years passed. The pilot programs expanded slowly, facing resistance and setbacks but gaining ground through demonstration of their practical benefits. More slaves were granted opportunities to transition to voluntary service. More administrators began to question the efficiency of systems built on coercion rather than cooperation. And always, in quiet moments, I would think about Verdania. I never did reach the world of Yorik's memories, never saw the orchards and flowing rivers he had described, but I came to understand that Verdania was not just a place. It was a state of being, a way of relating to existence that valued human dignity and the possibility of choice. I found my own version of Verdania in the work I did, in the people I helped, in the small acts of kindness and recognition that reminded both them and me that we were more than the sum of our circumstances. Sometimes, late at night when the spaceport was quiet, I would stand at my window and look up at the stars. Somewhere among them was the world where Jorik had been born, where apple trees still grew in orchards tended by people who chose their own paths. Somewhere among them were thousands of other worlds, each with their own versions of beauty and possibility. And somewhere, in the darkness beneath hive cities across the galaxy, people were dreaming dreams that might one day lead them to remember their humanity. The metal leaf still sits on my desk, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, human beings remain capable of creating something beautiful. It is a testament to the truth that Jorik taught me in those desperate hours when we first dared to dream of freedom. We are more than what they tell us we are. We are more than the roles assigned to us, more than the functions we are expected to perform, more than the limitations imposed by systems built on fear and control. We are human beings, with all the terrible and wonderful possibilities that implies. We are capable of choice, even when that choice seems impossible. We are capable of hope, even in the face of despair. We are capable of love, even when surrounded by hatred. And sometimes, if we are very fortunate, we are capable of transformation, not just of ourselves, but of the world around us. One choice at a time, one act of courage at a time, one moment of recognition at a time. The dream of freedom is not just about escaping physical chains. It is about remembering that those chains, however strong they may seem, are not the final truth about human existence. The final truth is written in the space between one heartbeat and the next, where we discover that we have the power to choose who we will become. This is my testimony, recorded for those who might one day need reminding. We began as slaves, but we did not end as slaves. We chose to become something else, something more, something worthy of the dreams that had sustained us through the darkest hours of our captivity. And in making that choice, we discovered that freedom is not a destination to be reached, but a way of walking through whatever world we find ourselves in. It is the metal leaf hidden against the heart, the memory of sunlight on skin that has known only artificial light, the voice that speaks truth even when truth is dangerous. It is the moment when we stop asking permission to be human and simply choose to be.